What if I told you the people we call president were never truly in charge? What if every decision we were taught to believe came from the Oval Office? The declarations, the laws, the wars, the policies were actually the echoes of decisions made somewhere else by people you'll never read about in your history textbooks. For more than 2 centuries, a silent network of bankers, industrialists, and political brokers has operated behind the curtains of American power, shaping presidents rather than being shaped by them. This is not conspiracy. This is the forgotten story of how America's wealth built its government, and how the presidency itself became a mask for the ambitions of the powerful few. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the hidden presidents, the unelected men who controlled the nation's finances, dictated its policies, and guided it through wars and crises for their own ends. Because if you follow the money, you begin to realize something chilling. The White House was never the top of the pyramid. The real power, the kind that moves nations, has always been invisible, patient, and generational. So, who really ruled America? And what did the founders know or hide about the true source of power in their new republic? Let's start with the beginning. The so-called revolution. The story we're told is about liberty and independence, but the revolution was just as much about debt. By the time the Declaration of Independence was signed, the colonies were broke. The Continental Army marched on empty promises and unpaid bills. Enter Robert Morris, a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who became known as the financier of the Revolution. Morris wasn't a soldier or a philosopher, he was a businessman. When the Continental Congress ran out of funds, it was Morris who stepped in, using his private fortune and influence with European lenders to keep the war going. He became the de facto treasurer of the United States before the nation even had a president. And for his efforts, he and his circle secured more than just gratitude. They secured control. Morris founded the Bank of North America in 1781, the country's first national bank, a private corporation that held the government's money and decided how it flowed. This single institution gave private investors, many of them British, power over America's future. And when the war ended, the Founding Fathers debated liberty in public, but behind closed doors, they argued over who would own the nation's debt. George Washington was a land speculator. Jefferson and Madison were deeply tied to plantation wealth. Hamilton, the architect of the first Bank of the United States, was openly allied with elite financiers who saw the new nation as an investment opportunity. They created a system where the government owed its existence to creditors, and those creditors could shape policy. From day one, the presidency was surrounded by invisible chains of obligation. The Revolution had freed America from Britain's monarchy, but it replaced a king with something far more enduring, a financial aristocracy. By the 1790s, a new kind of figure emerged in the capital, the lobbyist. These were not elected men. They weren't soldiers or philosophers. They were middlemen, go-betweens for wealthy speculators who held piles of depreciated war bonds. These bonds had been bought from struggling veterans for pennies on the dollar. Now, with the new government forming, these same speculators wanted Congress to redeem them at full value, an instant fortune. To make it happen, they wined and dined representatives, offered favors, and whispered promises. And Alexander Hamilton, whose policies aligned perfectly with their interests, became their champion. His assumption plan, where the federal government took on state debts, sounded patriotic, but it funneled wealth into the hands of insiders. It turned America's obligations into private profit. For every speech about democracy, There was a quiet meeting in a tavern, a handshake deal, a loan extended to a future politician. The first American capital was filled with stock jobbers, early speculators who gambled on insider knowledge from Congress. The line between politics and profit blurred almost instantly. While Washington warned against factions, those factions were already being bankrolled by the nation's wealthiest men. The Yazoo land scandals, where vast tracts of land were sold off to investors through bribed legislatures, showed just how deep the rot went. What we call lobbying today began right here, a system built not on representation, but on influence. Presidents might have been elected by the people, but the policies they signed into law were often written by the invisible class that funded them. By the 1820s, America's banking elite had grown so powerful that even presidents began to fear them. Nicholas Biddle, president of the Second Bank of the United States, was one of those men who ruled without ever standing for election. He controlled the nation's money supply. He decided who received loans, which states prospered, and which fell into crisis. When President Andrew Jackson tried to challenge that power, calling the bank a monster, Biddle struck back by restricting credit across the country, deliberately causing economic chaos to show the consequences of defying him. Farmers went bankrupt, businesses collapsed, and Congress, filled with men indebted to the bank, turned against Jackson. This was America's first showdown between democracy and the financial deep state. Jackson won the battle. He shut down the bank in 1836, but he lost the war. Private financiers filled the vacuum. Foreign capital poured in from London and Paris, and American banking houses like Brown Brothers and Baring Brothers became the unofficial rulers of credit. The presidency had proven one thing: it could not survive without borrowed money. Every administration since that time, no matter how independent it claimed to be, depended on private lenders and the networks that moved wealth. Even the 1837 financial panic that followed Jackson's victory was engineered by those same networks. The hidden presidents didn't sit in the White House. They sat on boards, in banks, and in back rooms, deciding the fate of millions with a pen stroke. When the Civil War broke out, the same financial forces that had once divided the nation now saw an opportunity to reshape it. The war was devastating, but it was also profitable. The Union government, desperate for money, sold war bonds to private bankers, and those bankers dictated terms. Jay Cooke became the war's true treasurer, raising billions through bond sales and earning enormous commissions in return. His influence over the Treasury Department was so complete that he could effectively steer national policy. Lincoln, desperate to fund the war, was forced to cooperate. The greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold, were issued not out of innovation, but necessity. Yet even then, Wall Street dictated when and how that money would be valued. When the war ended, a new class of rulers emerged: the industrial magnates. Men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan took control not just of businesses, but of governments. Morgan personally bailed out the U.S. Treasury twice. He financed wars, built monopolies, and hand-picked presidents who would protect his interests. He wasn't elected, but he didn't need to be. Political campaigns cost money, and Morgan's network of bankers supplied it. By the 1880s, senators and congressmen were openly referred to as the servants of the trusts. The republic had evolved into a machine where capital decided policy. Presidents changed. Power didn't. The age of the hidden presidents was no longer secret. It was systemic. By the early 1900s, the system was complete. In 1907, when another banking panic hit, a small group of financiers met in secret on Jekyll Island, Georgia. Their goal? To design a new central bank, one that would give private banks control over public money under a government facade. They succeeded. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and the Federal Reserve System was born. To most Americans, it looked like reform, a way to stabilize the economy. But behind the curtain, it gave a private network of bankers permanent influence over interest rates, inflation, and the money supply. The old financial families, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers, now had legal authority to do what their predecessors had done in secret. From that point forward, every president inherited a system where the nation's currency, debt, and markets were managed by unelected men. Wars were funded through Fed-issued bonds. Booms and crashes could be created at will. And as lobbying became professionalized, corporations learned that it was cheaper to buy a congressman than to fight one. By the mid-20th century, think tanks and policy institutes like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Brookings Institution became the new cabinet behind the cabinet. Politicians came and went, but the experts, bankers, and industrialists behind them remained. The invisible presidency had gone global, operating through trade deals, military contracts, and international finance. The White House became a stage, but the script was written elsewhere. So after all this, who really rules America? Is it the man elected every 4 years, or the network of financiers, lobbyists, and institutions that have guided this nation since its birth? From Robert Morris to J.P. Morgan, from Nicholas Biddle to the Federal Reserve, one truth remains. The presidency has always been constrained by money, and money has always belonged to the few. Presidents make speeches about freedom and progress, but their ability to act, to declare war, to build, to reform, depends on unseen approval from those who hold the purse strings. The hidden presidents don't wear flags or campaign buttons. They sit in boardrooms. They write legislation before it's voted on. They determine the costs of war, the price of peace, and the limits of democracy. America calls itself a republic, but beneath the surface, it has always been a corporation, with shareholders, not citizens, guiding its destiny. But knowing that truth gives us power. Awareness is the first step toward accountability. So now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about today's video? Do you believe the presidency is still independent, or is America still ruled by invisible hands? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below. And remember, history isn't what they teach you, it's what they hide from you. Stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next one.